best of June at Competitive Twitter. My name is Ken Lee, and I'm joined by a new co-host.
It's Eamon Conahan. I'm here replacing Don Harder, who's gone off to pastures new.
I'd let you pronounce your own last name.
Thanks very much.
Yeah. So in times past, we've usually taken on the top 3 tweets, the most read tweets, but we're going to have a focus, and going forward on the best of the 3, we choose the one that we think has most meaningful and significance to our audience, but just something that we can really drill into a little bit more and also be a little bit tighter in our podcasts. And this time we both agreed on the lack of women in science leadership.
Yeah, I think so. You probably noticed from my accent that I'm not from these parts. I'm from New Zealand. I've arrived not a moment too soon. This is a feminist issue, and of course we're the first democracy to have given the vote to women, Ken Lee. And in fact, our last two of our...
Should I be giving you a pat on the back?
Oh, yeah, we're quite a feminist country. So 2 of our past 3 national leaders were women. So I'm as qualified as any bloke can possibly be to speak on this subject, although obviously I would still defer to a woman. But this article was written by Elizabeth Irons, who had a point that there's just not enough women making it to the top in science leadership. She noted that the majority of PhD graduates in STEM subjects were now women, yet the minority of tenured professorships went to women, and only 25% of NIH-sponsored faculty awards went to women. So there's certainly not any problem with the pipeline of women going into these fields, but they're not quite rising to the top as she might have hoped.
It's interesting. There's a stark statistic that should startle any male or female here, and it's the work week. And the crux of this, she believes, is the lack of support for women in maternal care. Mm-hmm. That is the primary difference, probably, between males and females, the bearing and raising of children. But to do both, women in faculty positions have to work 100 hours per week, whereas the average, for example, a male or a woman who doesn't have children works 50 hours per week. So that's working twice as hard. You'd have to think that would factor into women not making the leadership positions if they're burnt out.
Well, that's right, and not only are they burnt out, but of course they're distracted and drawn away from work hours at all times of the day because of emergencies going on in the household or at school. And we all know from our own experience, as understanding as we try to be, that when a colleague isn't available when we need them, we feel frustrated by that. And I'm sure it's the same with the colleagues of women in science or any field when they're drawn away from their workplace. But it's an interesting point that you raised, because this article presented a couple of other statistics that suggest there's at least no glass ceiling in academia. Single women were just as likely to succeed as men with children, which is probably not something that happens in corporate America. So this really came down to more an issue of parenting. It was mums were 35% less likely than male colleagues to enter the tenure track, and they were 27% less likely to achieve tenure after entering the tenure track. So this was really more about parenthood, I felt, than it was necessarily a feminist issue, having just spouted on about my qualifications to speak.
I think that was a little national pride. That's
So, because it's an interesting point, I think like a lot of Generation X, or the tail end of Generation X, and the start of Generation Y, couples are now probably starting to sit down and have the conversation about starting a family. And they're probably, as part of that conversation, more than any time in the past, asking, well, who's going to be the primary caregiver? I think men are more inclined to do it than they've ever been in the past, and whilst I'm sure it's not a majority, I'm sure there is a growing group of men who are prepared to take on that role. So people are asking themselves, who's going to do it, who's going to take it on, and whoever it happens to be, man or woman, certainly as far as it relates to academia and sciences, is probably going to suffer as a result, according to these statistics.
And that goes back to, you're talking about suffering, regardless...
Career-wise.
Regardless of your gender, career-wise. And so I'm going to bring in another article that we both have read. It's from The Atlantic, and it got thousands of comments, and the title is very provocative, because it's almost counterintuitive to the feminist movement that you talked about. That feminist movement, which sprung from the 60s, and now today's women are benefiting from that, is that women can have it all. We can be a career mom, and we can, well, that says it all. We have a career and we're a mommy. This one, the title by the policy director under Secretary Hillary Clinton, and now she's back to her job as Dean of Princeton. So well qualified to talk about this subject. The title is Why Women Still Can't Have It All. Now, this is not, she's saying, necessarily just about women. And this gets back to your point about suffering. And that is, it's not just a woman or man thing. It's not a gender thing. It's how we look at work thing. And part of that is, if you look at a lawyer, how does a lawyer bill? It's kind of like how we bill. It's by the hour.
Exactly.
And it's valuing that hourly payment, and which cheapens it. If we bill by the hour, then that's what lawyers do. They actually add undue costs because they're billing by the hour, and they're probably not.
There's no incentive to be efficient in a system.
There's no incentive to be efficient. Sounds like healthcare to me. But she gives a great example. Richard Darman, who was in a previous administration, who, to make it appear that he worked late, would leave the light on in the suit coat there.
Right.
That's the cultural norm that everyone is fighting against.
Exactly. And I think it's particularly pervasive in corporate culture, and probably even slightly more so in America, where the system is built on a 2 weeks of vacation system. Now, I've worked here in New Zealand, in Australia, and in Ireland, where they all have between 3 and 4 weeks of vacation. Right, that's just as a starting point. And I think one of the other things that prevents is a lot of Americans can't really travel overseas until they're retired because they just don't have enough leave to do so. And another area it strikes is maternity leave. What is the average maternity leave here in America? Do you know, Ken?
I mean, I think it could be anywhere from a few months to 6 to 8 months,
right?
Based on that particular company policy.
Yeah. So it does come down a lot to the company policy, and people just don't have that leave. I think there's an ingrained, and as I say, I don't mean this just to apply to America because it does happen right across the world, but this ingrained culture of working harder is better. It's something to be extremely proud of, and indeed it is, but families can suffer as a result, and it's that time-honoured challenge of trying to strike the work-life balance. Now, obviously what we're evolving out of in the workplace currently is a system where traditionally there was a man who went off to the office or to the work site or wherever it was and worked as long and hard as he could, and mum stayed at home with the kids. And that created an unrealistic expectation on behalf of employers that's never ceased ever since. This expectation that there will always be one supported spouse that can go into the workplace and work unequivocally for as long hours as is necessary. Society's become a little bit more sophisticated and complex since then, and it's not quite so easy for either spouse to disappear into the work vacuum and not come back until the job is done.
Yeah, there's so we're talking about men and women, and Anne-Marie Slaughter talks about some of her heroes. And she actually is a Democrat, and such as she worked under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, but Governor Christie was thinking about entering the presidential race, but decided due to family matters that he would not. And she made an interesting observation. In Washington, there is a default. If you've been fired or let go unceremoniously, that person is then said to have been departing due to family matters. And that's what she's talking about, the cultural norms. Why would that, when Washington politicians talk so much about family values, that the default excuse for being fired is you're doing something for the family? That's looking at family in a way that is not highly prioritized or valued. And so that's what we need to talk about, is switching those norms. And she gives several great examples of how that's being done. The first thing is really looking at a telecommuting policy. And that's not a telecommuting policy where you can come in maybe one day a week from a off-site and call in for reserved for a few people. It's making it more of the standard. Look at if your job, if you're able to work from off-site, and then make that the default. Now, along with that, it's merging it with a workday that coincides with a school day. So you make business meetings happen when your children are at school.
Right.
And so after those, you can still have meetings after those, but that gets your face time, because face time is still important, establishing that trust, those relationships. But then after that school period, then people won't feel as guilty. Both people who call in and people who are present at the office won't feel resentful because you've made that the standard policy.
It's interesting what you say about FaceTime, because FaceTime is obviously still important, but you and I both work in a service industry, and because of the power of technology, we actually have less literal FaceTime than we've ever had before. When we present concepts to clients, for instance, we often do that via WebEx. So, in actual fact, people are in each other's physical presence less and less in the workday now. So that opens the door to create an environment where people can work from home, they can harness the technological tools available to still participate in the workday, but whilst also being available to their kids if necessary. So it seems to make perfect sense to me. Why, if the tools are there, why wouldn't we make use of them?
Yeah, and that gets back to this lack of women in science leadership by Elizabeth Eilorns, who actually has a service where scientists, women scientists, probably male scientists as well, they can outsource some of the lab work that's repetitive and be able to manage their work-life balance a little bit better. Technology is part of the issue, but I always think it is one thinking in a new way. And what's interesting is not just, it's also women who have their own, they value this as well. What we've just talked about, working long hours, working hourly, all those things, having the expectations set by their mothers, I don't know what you call it, but to work hard. We gave you the opportunity, now go seize that opportunity and be something. But when somebody else, another woman, for example, drops out of the career race and says, I want to raise a family, they frown upon that.
Yeah.
And so women themselves have to come to terms with what this means. And it's not about having it all necessarily. You have to make the choices that are right for you, but let other people have those choices without judging them. Maybe That's what I'm getting to.
Quite right. And I mean, it's an interesting point, because in academia, less so perhaps than in corporate environments, one would imagine there's some extra freedom to accommodate parents, be they male or female. Because to make tenure, for instance, and this is what this paper is about, to make tenure, Ken, talk us through some of the things that an aspiring professor needs to have proven to make tenure, and is there leeway to accommodate those within a modified workday?
Well, I think it's somewhat of an extension of being a graduate student. To become a PhD student, it depends on whether you've published or not. And I think the same would accrue for a professor getting tenureship. How many papers, so that's quantity, and then quality is how many were impactful.
Sure.
Usually based on if you've got into a major caliber publication like Science, and or whether or not that paper's been really referenced a lot, and going out on the circuit and speaking about those papers.
Sure.
So I think it's publications, and publications means funding. They go hand in hand. You have to be a well-funded lab to be able to produce the research you want to.
Okay. Well, it's an interesting point, because I was sort of suspected that was what people had to do to reach tenure in the university system here in America. And it raised an interesting point about publishing papers, because obviously there's an expectation that you'll publish prolifically and over a prolonged period of time, which kind of works against someone who wants to take time out for 5 years of their life to be a mum or dad. But it raises some interesting research that I read by an author called Dean Keith Simonton, who actually did a study of leading scientists in the field and compared them against scientists who weren't necessarily leaders, perhaps more part of the pack, to try and see how prolific they were in publishing over the course of their careers and what proportion of those papers had a high impact, and to then compare that year on year to see if there was any sort of trend, any kind of curve that coincided with their most productive period. And what he actually found is that it's incredibly consistent. For an outstanding scientist, they're going to publish roughly the same amount of papers year on year throughout their career, and that roughly the same proportion of those papers are going to be cited and regarded as high impact. So do you really need someone to produce that body of evidence over the course of 10 or 15 years, or if they've done it over the course of 5 or 6 years and then they take time out to be a parent and they come back, have they not already done enough to prove, based on the research of Simonton, that they're going to make it as a tenured professor?
Well, this goes back to exploring some of our fundamental assertions or just beliefs. We talked about one of those ways of life that's just automatic is this school system, and how that's, the school hours not linking up with the work hours, because the school hours are based on a time when people farmed. Mm-hmm. And now we've switched to 9 to 5, the school hasn't caught up to us. Right. Or vice versa. Maybe it shouldn't be 9 to 5. That goes back to other types of assumptions. One is, what is a productive life cycle? We used to retire, or I think we still do retire at 65. Anne-Marie Slaughter's assertion is, if you can actually have a 50-year career, let's say starting at 30, going to 80, or going from 25 to 75. And so if you look at that expanded view of somebody's productive life, why must it be all crunched down to the first 5 years of tenureship? Why can't, and she argues this, we make this system good for women, and she argues what a system that's good for women is also good for men, right? And have some interventions, mini breaks, if you will. So maybe you can work that 5 years, something like that, take a break and come back, and then that extended body of work is what you look at to determine tenureship.
It's an interesting point that you make, because I'm finding more and more people that are my peers are doing that, even not for children. They're just taking extended career breaks. I know of 2 or 3 people who have just taken a year off. In fact, one gentleman took 3 years off. God love him, he had the salary to be able to do that when he was employed. But those breaks probably don't hurt from time to time, and especially if either they're to have a child or to go travelling or some kind of life-affirming experience, I'm sure that they actually add to the intellectual property that person takes into the next phase of their career.
And you would think it would add to the IP of the company as well. It's hard to find good talent. That's probably the number one thing that makes a company great, is identifying and recruiting and nurturing that talent. So if you have it, it behooves you then to make family-friendly policies. So it includes males and females, includes people who don't have maybe kids or a spouse, but they have a parent that they need to take care of. And it's expanding the view of this, not just children, but family in general, putting a priority on family.
Indeed, I agree. I think change is the order of the day, Ken, and if this little podcast maybe starts off a movement, in combination, of course, with Elizabeth Ion's paper, we've done our job today.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Eamon.
Nice one. Thanks, Ken.
Well, if you want to send any comments our way, we have an email, twitter@competitive.com, or just tweet @competitive. We'd be happy to hear from you. Thanks a lot, guys. This is Ken.
And Eamon.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.